The folding chair creaked under me as I leaned forward to hear the lawyer better, and that small sound, metal against metal, ordinary and stupid, is the thing I remember most clearly from the worst afternoon of my life. My name is Marianne. I'm 58 years old, and 3 days after we buried my father, I sat in a beige conference room on the second floor of Hargrove and Lutz, watching a man I'd known since I was 26 clear his throat and tell me that my name did not appear in my father's will. Not once. Not anywhere. I'm an accountant. I've spent 30 years of my life reading documents for a living, contracts, ledgers, fine print other people skip over because they trust someone else to read it for them. I am the person other people hire to make sure they aren't being cheated. And I sat in that room, in my black funeral dress that still smelled faintly of the lilies from the service, and I could not make the words on that page rearrange themselves into something that made sense. My sister Diane sat 2 chairs down from me. She didn't look at me. She looked at her hands, folded very neatly in her lap, and there was something in the stillness of her that I would spend the next several weeks trying to name. 22 years. That's how long I'd been co-signing loans for Diane, car loans, a kitchen renovation, 2 business ventures that folded within 18 months each, a bridge loan for years ago that I still didn't fully understand the purpose of. 22 years of phone calls that started with Mayor, I hate to ask, and ended with my signature on a line I barely read because I trusted the person handing me the pen. I thought I knew exactly where I stood in this family. I was the responsible one. The one who showed up. The one who drove 40 minutes each way every Sunday for the last 6 years to sit with our father after the dementia made conversation difficult and silence necessary. Diane visited when she could, when her schedule allowed, when the kids didn't have something, when life wasn't so overwhelming, which it always, somehow, was. I held this family together. I believed that. I had built an entire identity around it. The lawyer, Tom Hargrove, set the document down on the table between us and folded his hands on top of it, the way people do when they're about to say something they've rehearsed. "Marianne," he said, and something in his voice made the back of my neck go cold before he even finished the sentence. There's no easy way to say this. I looked at Diane. She still wasn't looking at me. And underneath the table, where no one could see, my hands had already started to shake. The thing about grief is that it doesn't wait politely for you to be ready. It arrives in the middle of ordinary moments and rearranges the furniture of your life without asking permission. 3 weeks before the funeral, my father was still alive, still sitting in his recliner by the window of the assisted living facility. Still occasionally calling me by my mother's name when the afternoon light hit a certain way and something in his mind slipped backward 30 years. I didn't mind. I'd stopped minding a long time ago. I would just say, "It's Marianne, Dad," gently, the way you'd correct a child without making them feel foolish, and he'd blink and come back to himself, and we'd keep talking about nothing, the weather, the Pirates game on mute in the corner, whether the food was any good that week. Diane visited less. I told myself this was fair. She had 2 teenagers, a husband who traveled for work, a life that was simply fuller than mine. I divorced 12 years ago and never remarried, and my own kids were grown and settled 3 states away. Building lives that didn't have much room for me in them either, though I tried not to think about that too hard. I had time. Diane didn't. That was the story I told myself, and it had the comfortable shape of something true, the way certain lies do when you've worn them smooth from handling. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was that Diane wasn't just visiting less. She was visiting differently. There was a Tuesday, about 4 months before he died, when I stopped by unannounced and found my father's bedside drawer slightly open. Inside was the leather folder where he kept his important papers, bank statements, his old checkbook, copies of documents he liked to keep close even though he could no longer really read them. I noticed the folder looked thinner than I remembered. I noticed, and then I closed the drawer, and then I made myself a cup of the terrible communal coffee in the lobby and didn't think about it again. That's the kind of detail you don't weigh properly in the moment. It's only afterward, turning it over and over like a stone in your pocket, that you understand you were holding evidence and calling it nothing. I didn't ask Diane about it. Not because I didn't want to know. I think, if I'm honest with myself now, It's because some part of me was afraid of what asking might cost the peace, the fragile arrangement where I was the responsible daughter and she was the busy one, and neither of us had to examine that division too closely. So I said nothing. I drank my coffee. I drove home. And life went on being, as far as I knew, exactly what it had always been. The call came on a Thursday morning in March, the kind of pale gray light that makes everything look slightly underexposed. The facilities director, not Diane, told me my father had passed peacefully in his sleep. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and thinking, with a kind of detached clarity that frightened me a little, I should call Diane. She already knew. The facility had called her first. I didn't think anything of that at the time. She lived 20 minutes closer. It made sense. It would be one of many things, in the weeks that followed, that made sense right up until the moment it didn't. The week between the funeral and the will reading is a blur I've had to reconstruct in pieces, the way you rebuild a room from photographs after a fire. I remember the funeral home's carpet, a deep burgundy that swallowed sound. I remember Diane crying real tears, I believed then, I still believe now, because grief and guilt can look identical from the outside and sometimes even from the inside. I remember standing beside her at the reception afterward, our shoulders almost touching, accepting condolences from cousins I hadn't seen in a decade, and feeling, for the first time in years, something like closeness between us. Shared loss has a way of doing that. It strips away the small accumulated distances and leaves you standing next to the only other person who remembers your mother's voice, your childhood kitchen, the specific sound your father made when he laughed at his own jokes. I let myself believe that closeness meant something. I think I needed it to. It was during the reception that I first noticed Diane's husband, Roger, watching me with an expression I couldn't place. Not unkind, exactly, but careful. Cautious. The way you look at someone you know is about to be hurt and you don't know how to warn them. I caught it once, across the room, and then he looked away and busied himself with a tray of sandwiches, and I told myself I'd imagined it. There was also a moment, small, easy to miss, when my cousin Patricia mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd run into Diane at the bank a few months back, doing something with your dad's accounts. Very sweet of her to help him with all that. I remember smiling and saying yes, Diane had always been good with that kind of thing, even though some small cold part of me noted that I had never once been told Diane was handling our father's accounts. I had assumed, when I thought about it at all, that his finances were simple, a pension, a small savings account, nothing requiring active management. I didn't ask Patricia anything more. I changed the subject to the lovely flower arrangements instead. That's the kind of thing you do when you've spent a lifetime keeping the peace. You hear a sentence that should stop you cold, and instead you smile and reach for the next polite thing to say, because stopping cold in the middle of a funeral reception feels like the wrong kind of scene to make, and you've never been someone who makes scenes. In the days after the funeral, before the will reading, I went back to my own life, because that's what you do. You go back to work, you answer emails, you water the plants that have gone dry while you weren't looking. I run a small accounting practice out of a converted storefront on 5th Street, mostly small businesses and a handful of retirees who like having someone they can call by first name. My clients didn't know what had happened in my family. I didn't tell them. I sat across the desk from Mrs. Henley going over her quarterly numbers and felt the strange doubling of grief, half of me present, competent, doing the work I'd done for 30 years, and half of me somewhere else entirely. Still standing in that burgundy carpeted room. My best friend Carol called every evening that week. Carol and I had known each other since college, and more relevantly, Carol was a paralegal at Hargrove and Lutz, the very firm handling my father's estate. We'd been close enough, for long enough, that I'd never thought twice about the overlap. If anything, I'd found it comforting. Familiar face in an unfamiliar process. "How are you holding up?" she asked, on the Wednesday before the reading, and there was something in her voice, a beat too long before the question, a carefulness in the phrasing, that I noted and then set aside, the way I'd set aside the open drawer. The way I'd set aside Roger's careful look across the reception room. "I'm okay," I told her. "Tired. Diane and I are actually doing better than I expected. We talked more this week than we have in years. There was a pause on the line. "That's good," Carol said finally. "That's really good, Mare." I didn't ask why she'd hesitated. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief makes you read significance into ordinary silences, that everyone around me was simply being careful with me because I'd just lost my father and people are careful with the grieving. I went to bed that night and slept, for the first time in over a week, without waking at 3 in the morning with my heart going too fast for no reason I could name. I didn't know yet that my body had been keeping better track of things than my mind was willing to. The reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Diane called me Sunday night, her voice warm, almost girlish in a way that reminded me of us as children, sharing a bedroom, telling secrets after lights out. "I just want you to know," she said, "whatever happens with all this, the house, the money, whatever Dad decided, I don't want it to come between us. We're all we have left now." I told her I felt exactly the same way. I meant it completely. I hung up the phone and sat for a while in the quiet of my living room, and I let myself feel, for the first time since the funeral, something close to peace. "We're all we have left now." I held on to that sentence like a warm stone in my pocket. I had no idea, sitting there, that the sentence was already a lie, not necessarily a cruel one, not necessarily even a conscious one, but a lie all the same, spoken by someone who already knew exactly what the will said and exactly what it would do to me, 2 days before I would find out. The lawyer's office on the day of the reading smelled like burnt coffee and the particular dry, papery scent of old buildings in late winter. I'd worn the black dress again. I hadn't thought to pack anything else, hadn't really thought of this as a separate occasion from the funeral itself, still part of the same long gray week. Tom Hargrove had been our family's lawyer since before I was born, inherited the practice from his father the way some men inherit a watch. He was kind in the way of someone who has delivered bad news so many times that kindness has become a professional skill rather than a spontaneous one. He greeted Diane and me with the same gentle handshake, the same murmured condolences, and ushered us into the conference room where Carol was already seated at a side table with a stack of files, here in her professional capacity rather than as my friend. I remember being glad she was there. I remember thinking it would make the process feel less clinical, having a familiar face in the room. I did not yet understand that Carol's presence in that room was the first piece of evidence I would later have to reckon with. The reading itself took perhaps 20 minutes. Tom read through the preliminary language, the boilerplate about sound mind and revoking all prior wills, the kind of legal phrasing that exists to be skimmed rather than absorbed. I sat with my hands folded, waiting for the part that concerned me, half listening the way you listen to an airline safety demonstration, certain on some level that none of it would actually apply to you. The house, our childhood home, the one with the cracked driveway and the maple tree out front that Diane and I had climbed as girls, went to Diane. Outright, no conditions. The remaining liquid assets, what I'd assumed, vaguely, was a modest savings account, turned out to be considerably more than modest. Our father had been quietly conservative his whole life, had invested well decades ago and never spent much. The number Tom read aloud was large enough that I had to replay it in my head to be sure I'd heard it correctly. All of it went to Diane. There was a smaller provision, a trust, oddly specific, established for Diane's 2 children, naming Diane as trustee with full discretionary control. And then Tom set the document down, and there was a silence in the room that I can still feel in my chest if I let myself sit with it too long, and he said my name, and he told me there was no provision for me at all. Not the house. Not the savings. Not even one of those small symbolic bequests people sometimes leave, a piece of jewelry, a specific keepsake, to my daughter Marianne, my mother's ring, nothing. My name did not appear in the document a single time. I asked him to read it again. He did, more slowly, watching my face the whole time as if checking for some sign I might break in a way he'd need to manage. I didn't break. Not then. I sat very still, and I felt something in my chest go cold and quiet in a way I didn't have a name for yet, and I looked at Diane, who was looking at her hands, and I asked the only question I could find words for. When was this signed? Tom checked the date on the document. 14 months ago, he said. 14 months ago. I tried to place myself there, What had I been doing 14 months ago while my father sat somewhere signing away every trace of my existence from his estate? I'd been at the house for Easter that year. I remembered it specifically because I'd brought a ham and Diane had brought nothing, had arrived an hour late with some explanation about the kids' soccer schedule, and I had said nothing about it. Had simply set an extra place and carved the ham myself and told myself it didn't matter, that showing up mattered more than what you brought. 14 months ago, I had still believed I was the daughter who showed up. Was he? I started and stopped because I didn't know how to finish the question without it sounding like an accusation I wasn't ready to make out loud. Was he of sound mind? Was he pressured? Was this his decision or someone else's, dressed up in his handwriting? Tom answered the question I hadn't finished asking. There was a capacity evaluation done at the time of signing. It's standard procedure given his diagnosis. The evaluation found him competent to make decisions regarding his estate. He paused. I should also note, and I want to be transparent with you about this, Marianne Diane was present for the signing, as was her attorney. Her attorney. Not Tom. A separate lawyer, brought in specifically. Something tightened in my chest, a physical sensation, sharp and sudden, like a hand closing around something fragile. I looked at Carol, sitting at her side table with her eyes fixed very deliberately on the folder in front of her, not meeting mine, and I understood, not with certainty, not yet, but with the first cold edge of it, that the careful pause on the phone last week had not been grief. It had been knowledge. I didn't sleep that night or the one after. I lay in the dark doing the kind of math I'd spent 30 years doing for other people, adding up numbers, checking them against each other, looking for the place where the columns failed to balance. 22 years of co-signed loans. I started pulling old files the next morning, the ones I'd kept out of habit more than necessity, because I am the kind of person who keeps paperwork. The car loan from when Diane's first car died. The kitchen renovation 11 years ago that I'd co-signed because her contractor required 2 incomes on the application and Roger's commission-based pay didn't qualify on its own. The 2 failed business ventures, a boutique that lasted 14 months, a catering company that lasted 9. The bridge loan, for years ago, $18,000, purpose listed vaguely as family obligation, which I'd never questioned because by then asking questions had started to feel like an accusation I wasn't willing to make. I added it up. Across 22 years, my signature had guaranteed just over $200,000 of Diane's debt. Most of it she'd eventually paid down, slowly, with my credit on the line the entire time, my own loan applications occasionally complicated by debt that wasn't technically mine but appeared on every report regardless. I sat at my kitchen table with the old files spread in front of me like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was building, and something tightened in my throat that had nothing to do with crying. That afternoon, I called Patricia, the cousin who'd mentioned, at the funeral reception, seeing Diane at the bank with our father. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, to tell me more about that. Oh, it was nothing, really, Patricia said, the easy unconcern of someone who has no idea she's holding a piece of a puzzle. I just saw them together, maybe a year and a half ago. Diane was helping him with some paperwork at the teller window. I remember because your dad seemed a little confused, kept asking what he was signing, and Diane was very patient with him, explaining it. I thought it was sweet. A year and a half ago. Before the 14-month-old will. Before, possibly, whatever had set this entire process in motion. I thanked Patricia and hung up, and I sat with my hand still resting on the phone for a long moment, feeling the particular vertigo of realizing that an entire timeline you believed you understood has another timeline running underneath it. One you're only now being permitted to see. I want to be honest about something here, because I've thought about it many times since I had the chance, in that week, to call Diane directly. To say, simply, I need to understand what happened. I didn't take it. I told myself I needed more information first, that confronting her without proof would just give her room to deflect, to manage me the way she'd apparently been managing our father. But that wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of me was still afraid of what I'd lose if I asked the question out loud, the fragile new closeness from the funeral, the last sibling I had left, the story I'd told myself for 58 years about who we were to each other. So instead, I did what I do. I gathered evidence quietly, methodically, the way I'd been trained to do for clients who suspected their business partners of skimming. I requested copies of bank statements from the institution where our father had held his accounts. I was still listed, technically, as a secondary contact from years earlier, an old arrangement nobody had bothered to update. And it was enough to get partial records. What I found took 3 days to fully untangle. Beginning roughly 2 years before our father's death, there had been a series of transfers from his primary account, not large individually, $2,000 to $4,000 at a time, spaced out. The kind of pattern someone might design specifically to avoid triggering scrutiny. All transferred to an account I didn't recognize. I cross-referenced the routing number. It belonged to Diane and Roger's joint account. Over those 2 years, the transfers totaled just under $90,000. I sat very still after I found that number, the cursor blinking on my laptop screen, and I felt the particular physical sensation of a held breath I hadn't realized I was holding my chest tight. My hands cold despite the radiator clicking on beside me. There was a moment, that same evening, when I almost called Carol. I had my phone in my hand, her name pulled up, my thumb hovering over the call button. I wanted to ask her directly, did you know about this? Were you part of drafting this will? Why didn't you tell me? And I think some part of me wanted more than answers. Simply to hear her deny it convincingly enough that I could go back to believing things were what they'd seemed. I put the phone down without calling. I told myself I needed to see the rest of the picture first. That was true. But it was also true that I was afraid that if I asked and she confirmed it, I would lose the last person besides Diane who I'd believed was fully in my corner, and I wasn't ready to be that alone yet. She told me much later what she'd been carrying during those weeks I didn't call. I knew before the reading. I'd known for months. I'd helped file paperwork on a will I never should have touched once I understood what it did to her. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself client confidentiality wasn't a choice, it was a rule, and rules existed for reasons I didn't have to personally agree with. Every time Marianne called me that week, every time she said she was tired, but okay, I felt something close around my throat. I almost told her twice. Once, on the phone, the word was right there, I had it in my mouth, I could feel the shape of it, and then I thought about my job, about Diane's lawyer, about the firm's exposure if I broke confidentiality before the reading. And I swallowed it back down and asked her how she was sleeping instead. I told myself I was protecting the process. I think I was protecting myself. I didn't know any of that yet, sitting at my kitchen table with the bank statements spread in front of me. All I knew was the number, $90,000, moved quietly out of our father's account in the 2 years before his death, into the household of the daughter who had just inherited everything else. While I had spent those same 2 years driving 40 minutes each way every Sunday and signing my name to her debts without asking what they were really for. I printed the statements. I made copies. And for the first time since the will reading, I let myself feel something other than the cold, careful numbness I'd been wearing like a coat. I let myself feel angry. I called Diane on a Thursday evening and asked her to meet me, not at her house, not at mine, but at a coffee shop on Birch Street that neither of us had any particular history with. Neutral ground. I'd learned that much from 30 years of helping clients prepare for difficult conversations. Choose a space that doesn't belong to either side. She arrived 12 minutes late, which I noted and said nothing about, an old habit dying hard even now. I had the folder with me. Bank statements, loan documents, the printed timeline I'd built across 3 sleepless nights. I didn't open it right away. I let her sit down, order her coffee, settle into the kind of easy posture she'd always had, the posture of someone who has never once doubted that things would work out in her favor, because they always had. I need to understand something, I said, and I heard my own voice come out steady, almost clinical, the voice I used with clients delivering bad audit results. I found transfers from Dad's account to yours. Going back about 2 years. Almost $90,000. Something flickered across Diane's face, not shock. Recognition, quickly smoothed over. It's not what you think, she said. Then tell me what it is. She set her coffee cup down with exaggerated care, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something I recognized, but had never had directed at me quite this way, reasonable, patient. The tone of someone explaining something to a person who simply doesn't have all the facts. Dad wanted to help us. Roger's commission dropped 2 years ago. You know that, I told you about it. Dad offered. I didn't ask him for a dime of it, Marianne, he offered, because he could see we were struggling and you. She stopped herself, recalibrated. You were fine. You've always been fine. You have your practice, you have your house paid off, you've never once had to ask anyone for help in your entire life. Did it occur to you that maybe that's exactly why he didn't think you needed anything from him? I felt the floor of the conversation shift under me, the way it had in the lawyer's office, the way Tom's reading of the document had quietly turned into something I had to defend myself against rather than something done to me. That's not what this is about, I said, and I heard my voice stay level even as something inside my chest had begun, very quietly, to come apart. I co-signed $200,000 of your debt over 22 years, Diane. I drove 40 minutes every Sunday for 6 years while you visited when it was convenient. And somehow I'm the one who's fine. I'm the one who didn't need anything. You never asked for anything, Diane said, and there was an edge under the reasonableness now, something sharper trying to get through. You never once said, Diane, I need help, I need support, I need someone to show up for me. You just did things, the loans, the Sundays, all of it, and then you expected to be thanked for it without ever telling anyone what you actually needed. That's not generosity, Marianne. That's martyrdom. And you've been doing it our whole lives. I sat with that for a moment, and the terrible thing, the thing I haven't fully forgiven myself for yet, is that some small, treacherous part of me heard a grain of truth in it, even as I understood it was being weaponized against me in real time. I had never asked. I had simply assumed that doing was its own form of asking, that showing up consistently for 22 years constituted a request that should be self-evident. I didn't say any of that out loud. I felt my face go very still, very calm, in the particular way it does when something in me has decided that crying in front of this person is not an option I'm willing to give her. Were you helping him sign those transfers? I asked, the same way Patricia saw you helping him at the bank, explaining paperwork he didn't understand? Diane's jaw tightened. He understood exactly what he was doing. Then why did you bring your own lawyer to a will signing handled by the family's lawyer for 30 years? She didn't answer that. Instead, her eyes filled, fast and sudden, the way a kettle goes from silent to screaming, and her voice cracked. Do you have any idea what it's like, she said, being the daughter everyone compares to you? The responsible one, the smart one, the one who has her life together? I have spent my entire adult life being the disappointment, Marianne. Every family dinner, every conversation, Marianne's doing so well. Marianne never asks for help. Why can't you be more like your sister? I have heard that my whole life. So yes. When Dad started offering help, when he started actually seeing me, actually needing me to manage things for him instead of just needing you to show up and be perfect, I didn't stop it. I'm not going to apologize for that. For once in my life, I got to be the daughter who mattered. The coffee shop noise continued around us, oblivious, the hiss of the espresso machine, someone laughing at a nearby table, ordinary life proceeding exactly as it had a moment before, untouched by the thing that had just cracked open between my sister and me. I felt, in that moment, something I can only describe as a complete and total stillness arriving in my chest, replacing the anger I'd been carrying since the bank statements. Not numbness. Clarity. The specific, cold clarity of finally seeing something whole that you'd only ever seen in fragments before. I'm not going to fight you for the money, I said quietly. I'm not going to contest the will. I want you to understand why, though. It's not because I don't think what happened was wrong. It's because I finally understand that I have spent 22 years trying to earn a place in this family that you never actually thought I needed to earn, and I'm done doing that math. Diane opened her mouth, and I watched her search for the next thing to say, the next redirection, and I stood up before she could find it. Take care of yourself, Diane, I said, and I meant it, in the strange detached way you can mean something kind toward a person who has just hurt you more than almost anyone in your life. And then I walked out, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I trusted my hands enough to drive. It was only that night, alone in my kitchen, that everything I'd held back in that coffee shop finally arrived, not as anger this time, but as grief so large and so specific that I had to sit on the floor of my kitchen with my back against the cabinet and let it move through me like weather. It was Carol who called me 3 weeks later, asking to meet. We sat in my living room this time, not a coffee shop, and she didn't waste time getting to what she'd come to say. "He finally spoke to me," Carol said, and at first I thought she meant Tom, and then I understood she meant my father, that she was about to tell me something he'd told her, long before any of this, that she'd been carrying. About 2 months before the will was changed. He came into the office alone, without Diane, while I was covering the front desk for Tom's assistant. "He didn't know I was your friend outside of work, or maybe he did and didn't think it mattered. He asked me, very quietly, whether a person could change their mind about a will more than once." I felt my whole body go still. "I told him, of course," Carol continued. "And he said," I wrote it down later, Marianne, because something about the way he said it stayed with me. He said, "I don't want either of my girls to think I loved one more than the other." I just don't know how to say that on paper without it sounding like I'm choosing. And then Diane came in to pick him up, and he never finished the thought. I always wondered, afterward, whether he meant to come back and add you in some other way, a letter, a separate note, something, and just ran out of time before the dementia took more of him than it already had. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite peace, but was, perhaps, the beginning of both. "This is what I should have told you weeks ago," Carol said, and her voice had gone unsteady. "I'm so sorry, Marianne. I told myself confidentiality mattered more than you did, and that was a lie I needed in order to keep doing a job I was scared to lose. You needed a friend more than the firm needed my discretion, and I chose wrong. I don't know how to fix that, but I needed you to know I see it." I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't, not entirely, not yet. But I told her I understood why she'd been afraid, and that I believed she'd meant to do right by me even when she hadn't managed it, and something between us, frayed but not broken, held. Diane called once more, about 6 weeks after the coffee shop. I let it go to voicemail and listened to it twice before deciding what to do with it. Her voice was different than it had been across that table, quieter, less certain of its own footing. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said into the silence of my phone. "About not needing to earn a place. I don't think I ever really believed you had to earn one, Marianne. I think I needed you to believe it, because as long as you were busy proving yourself, I didn't have to look too closely at what I was taking. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I've earned that yet, either. I just wanted you to know that I know what I did. All of it. Not just the money, the whole shape of it, the whole 22 years of it. I'm sorry it took losing you to actually see it." I didn't call her back right away. I needed time to sit with the difference between an apology and an amends, and to figure out, slowly, which one this was. What I did instead, in the months that followed, was rebuild, not dramatically, not with any single grand gesture, but in the quiet accumulation of small decisions that added up to an entirely different life than the one I'd been living. I stopped answering calls that began with "I hate to ask, but..." I started saying, out loud, the things I needed instead of assuming that showing up consistently would eventually be recognized as a request. I took a trip alone, the first one in over a decade, to a coast I'd always wanted to see, and I sat on a rock above the water for an hour doing absolutely nothing useful for anyone but myself, and it did not feel like martyrdom or its opposite. It felt, simply, like being a person. I am still an accountant. I still read fine print for a living, still catch the discrepancies other people miss. But I read my own life differently now than I did before that beige conference room, before the folding chair creaked under me and a kind man told me my name wasn't anywhere on the page. I am not the woman who held everything together anymore. I'm something else now, something I'm still learning the shape of, 6 months out, but something that feels, for the first time in a long while, entirely my own. There's a particular kind of red flag that doesn't announce itself as danger, it just sits there, small and explainable, until you're standing in a room being told you don't exist on paper. And suddenly every quiet detail rearranges itself into a pattern you'd refuse to see. The open drawer. Patricia's offhand comment at the bank. Carol's pause on the phone that I told myself was nothing. I had pieces of this story for over a year before I had the whole of it, and I understand now that I wasn't blind to those pieces so much as unwilling to let them cost me the version of my family I needed to believe in. That's the thing about being the one who holds everything together. You start to mistake your own usefulness for your own worth, and you stop asking the question that might actually protect you. Not what can I give, but what do I actually need in return? I spent 22 years answering a question nobody asked me and calling it love. The turning point wasn't the will reading, not really. It was the moment in that coffee shop when Diane told me I'd never asked for anything, and some part of me recognized that she was right, even as I understood she was using that truth as a weapon. Both things were real at once. I had failed to ask. She had failed to offer. Neither of those facts excused what she did with our father's money, but understanding both of them is what finally let me stop needing her to be entirely a villain in order for me to leave the story behind. I think about my father sometimes, standing in that office asking Carol whether a person could change their will more than once, and I let myself believe, because it costs me nothing now and gives me something I need, that some part of him was trying to find his way back to me before the disease took that chance away from him too. I'll never know for certain. I've made my peace with not knowing. What I learned, in the end, wasn't really about money, or about wills, or even about Diane. It was about the difference between being needed and being valued, how easily, if you're not careful, you can spend an entire life mistaking one for the other, and how much it costs to finally tell them apart. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this. Notice the people who only call when they need something, and notice, just as carefully, whether you've ever let yourself need something back. You don't have to lose your name off a piece of paper to learn that lesson. I hope you don't have to. But if some part of this story sounded familiar to you, if some part of you recognized yourself in the daughter who showed up and never once said, "What about me?" let this be the moment you start asking. I'm not angry anymore most days. I'm something quieter than that now. Something that feels, finally, like my own.